Hello, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Libero, and this lecture is on Britain's long 19th century. I'm going to suggest to you that over what is called the long 19th century, which is from roughly 1789 to 1914, I'm going to suggest to you that Britain was truly great. But however, underneath this greatness, there were some fissures or some issues lying underneath it. Now, let's keep in mind that great does not always mean good. It can sometimes mean big and powerful. So many things happened over the 1800s in Britain, but I'm going to focus on four major developments in Britain and Britain's domains. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to answer the question, what made Britain great? And you will also be able to identify some potential issues or weak points in Britain's power and stability. So, what is Britain? England, Scotland, and Wales make up the island of Britain, and together with Ireland, they formed the United Kingdom or the UK in the 1800s. Together they are sometimes called the British Isles. However, be careful because Ireland is always considered something apart and separate. For example, don't refer to an Irish person as British. The British, in addition to Ireland, the British also controlled extensive overseas territories, making up a British Empire. This map shows the empire in pink at the start of the 19th century. And the people of Britain can sometimes be called Britons. Here are some famous Britons. These are modern Britons, so they are not strictly just English, Welsh, and Scots. For example, Lennon and McCartney's forebears immigrated to Liverpool from Ireland. Sir Trevor MacDonald, who was a newscaster in England, he hails from Trinidad. And Freddie Mercury was born Farrukh Bulsara on the island of Zanzibar. So part of what made Britain great was this ability to draw from people all over the globe and to interact on a global scale. To my mind, there are four kind of big developments in British history over the 1800s that you should understand. These four are military might, empire building, industrialization, and the gradual expansion of democracy. I will discuss each of these in turn, but as I lecture, you will see many places where they overlap with each other. You'll find instances where industrial growth affects voting or wars affect imperialism. Let's first start with Britain's military might. We'll start in 1789 with the French Revolution. This can be considered a useful starting point for a discussion about the 19th century, even though it's a little too early. Technically, that's still the 18th century. But the French Revolution was such a momentous event that it changed life drastically, not just for Frenchmen, but for people all over the world. In Britain, news of the turmoil at Versailles and Paris was greeted with increasing alarm. To be sure, some Britons were interested in the liberal changes taking place across the Channel, but as France became increasingly radical and violent with the execution of the French royals and the Reign of Terror, as this happened, Britons increasingly sided against the revolution. Britain went to war against France as a member of the First Coalition in 1793, and thereafter they repeatedly fought the Republic and later Napoleon. For these first few decades of the long 19th century, Britain was a very consistent enemy of France and consistently became a member of the various anti-France coalitions that went on. They fought on land, most famously in the Iberian Peninsula, and later in that final battle of Waterloo. And the British fought the French at sea, at the Battle of the Nile, the Battle of Copenhagen, the famous Battle of Trafalgar. What became clear by the time the dust had settled was that Britain was the world's leading naval power. And with the #1 navy, they could be a decisive force in European politics, especially when they were backed up by a strong army. So throughout the 19th century, you will see the British follow a blue water policy where they feel they must be supreme on the seas. And to do this, they began to make policies that their navy should be as large as the next two national navies combined. At the end of the Napoleonic era at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Britain's claims on overseas territories were cemented, so their claim on South Africa and Sri Lanka was cemented at the Congress of Vienna. And this meant that it kind of established a balance of power where the European powers would rarely contest Britain over what was established there. But they will fight over the acquisition of new territories. And meanwhile, Britain, after 1815, really tries to avoid continental disputes as far as they can, and they tend to become involved only when that balance of power seemed threatened. One time when it did seem threatened was in the Crimean War in the 1850s. The Crimean War, short version is it's Russia versus the world. Britain became involved because they didn't want Russia to become another strong power in sort of Western and Central Asia where the Ottoman Empire was. They wanted things to keep the same way they had been before. You will see a few other instances of this jockeying for power outside of Europe a few more times before the century ends. There were a series of crises out in the British Empire and on the borders of their empire. After Crimea, the biggest war for Britain occurred in 1898 in South Africa. It is usually called the Anglo-Boer War or the Second Boer War. And Boer is a Dutch word meaning farmers. So this so-called Boer War was essentially an uprising of Dutch-speaking South Africans against the British Empire. Ultimately, the British won, but with considerable difficulty. And one outcome of this war was it made Britain realize they had no friends. The French stayed out of the dispute. Germany encouraged the Boers. And Britain realized they came very close to actually losing their South African colony, which would disrupt their blue water policy because they want that foothold in the South Atlantic leading over to the Indian Ocean. So the Boer War made British politicians start to think about getting a little more involved in Europe again and to make alliances with other European powers. And you'll see where that leads to in a later lecture. So all of those military issues I spoke of, probably you're starting to see how they're very bound up and entangled with the question of empire. So let's turn to empire and look at a few more examples of conflicts in the British Empire. If you compare these two maps, the top one is from 1789 and the bottom is from 1920. Looking at these, it's clear that the British Empire started great and grew even greater over the long 19th century. As you know, the British lost some of their North American colonies in 1783. But even despite this really big loss, they were able to expand in Africa, Canada, Australia, and Asia. Most important is India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. From the late 1700s to the mid-1800s, the British conquered and seized many different states in the Indian subcontinent. And this was usually under a private trading company called the East India Company. There was also some cooperation with the Mughal emperor, who remained there as a figurehead. In 1857, a massive revolt erupted, and several Indian princes joined with some mutinous Indian soldiers to try to drive the British out. The British were eventually able to quell this revolt, partly due to the assistance of rival Indian princes and also with the assistance of some of the soldiers who remained loyal to Britain. After 1857, the Mughal emperor was deposed, the East India Company lost their power, and India came under the direct rule of the British Crown. This did not end the Indians' fight against the imperialists. The failure of 1857 made Indians realize that they would need to band together if they wanted to get the British out. The Indian National Congress was formed in 1885, and this Congress brought together all the different ethnicities and communal groups together with the aim of Indian independence. The Indian National Congress organized several activities to push for home rule, including a 1908 boycott of British-made goods. Now, if India was the jewel in the crown, Ireland was arguably the thorn in the side, and one event shaped this more than any other: the Irish Famine. I should mention there were famines in India as well. But for right now, we'll look a little more closely at what happened in Ireland. What happened is that around 1845, a previously unknown American microbe arrived in Europe. It was a fungus-like organism that lived off of potatoes. And when it got into the potatoes, it turned the potato into a kind of black and green mush that was inedible for humans or for animals. Okay, so the potato was the staple crop and the staple food for Irish people in this time period. When I say staple food, what I mean is that this one product represented the main bulk of people's calories. Now, for the poorest Irish people, that poorer strata, the potato was something like 80% of their total caloric intake. So when you have a staple food commanding so much of your entire food, your entire diet, sometimes other replacements are not always readily available. Remember, this is also the staple crop. So when that crop fails, there's not always another crop with easy access in some areas. As a staple crop, the potato tended to be grown in a monoculture, so this means just one crop, a monoculture of a field of potatoes as far as the eye can see. And when you have a monoculture, that allows diseases or parasites to spread very rapidly because there's nothing to stop them from moving on to the next plant. There's nothing in between for their favorite food or their favorite habitat. Now, when this disaster first started occurring, the British government under Prime Minister Peel attempted a robust response. They started to import more corn or other grains, and they used something called the Corn Laws to kind of finesse the prices and make sure the prices could go low so people could afford it. But in 1846, a new prime minister, Lord John Russell, he enforced a strict free trade agenda. So he was very strict that the government would not intervene in trade or economic situations. So by doing this, that meant that people could charge a very high price for alternative food products, or they could sell their products elsewhere, such as in England or France, and they don't even have to import the corn to Ireland where the people need it. It is estimated that Ireland lost over 20% of its population from 1845 to 1851. Half of this loss was through immigration, and the other half was through death. The death was sometimes directly through starvation and also hunger-related diseases. People couldn't fight a lot of diseases because they were too malnourished and weakened. Okay, so this means over 1 million people dead. That's 1 person in 5 gone from the community. The famine left long-term psychological and economic effects on Ireland, and it also represents a major failure of the British government to protect and serve its subjects. It sort of shows a breaking of the social contract that John Locke had talked about. That government has this kind of social contract to serve the people. So throughout the 1800s and the early 1900s, the Irish will fight and fight for independence because they know they cannot rely on the British for the kind of governance of a social contract, the kind of governance of protecting and serving the people. What I described in India and Ireland was formal imperialism. But it's also important to note that Britain was so great that they were able to push around other countries outside of their empire. This is a situation sometimes called informal imperialism or soft imperialism. You may not have realized that in the early 1800s, the British were the world's foremost international drug dealers. British traders took opium from Central Asia and they sold it in China, where addiction rates skyrocketed. The Chinese government wanted to put a stop to this. In response, the British government sent in gunboats to support their opium traders. China and Britain fought for 2 years, and Britain won. They won Hong Kong and the right to trade whatever they wanted to in 5 other Chinese ports. A second opium war was fought in the next decade with largely the same result. So this is called soft imperialism because the British don't rule China technically, but they're still able to call the shots a lot of the time. These events show how important trade was to the British government, and I think together with what we saw in India and Ireland, they suggest that the bottom line for the government was a little more high priority to them than moral considerations. I think these events also indicate that by the eve of World War I, Britain looks great on the map, but underneath that map, there's really a little more unstable and contested position than meets the eye, with places like Ireland, India, and their soft empire associates are always on the cusp of trying to break away or resist. Now, if we were meeting in person, I would be sure to stop right here and ask what questions or comments you had on any of the things that I've said so far. But since this is a YouTube video, please feel free to put some comments or questions in the comment area below. Let's turn to industrialization. This is, again, something that really made Britain kind of bigger and more powerful, or in another word, greater than some of the other countries going around. From the late 1700s, Britain was already actually the leader in industrial growth, right up to the end of the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution more or less started in Britain. Britain had a geographic advantage with its huge coal deposits. Britain artisans and scientists also had a cultural and an economic environment that would reward them for innovation. So there was a spirit of competition and encouragement to develop these. Britain also had an overseas empire that helped them provide raw materials, and in the empire there was also the demand for the finished goods. So they're really poised for success here. So I'll just kind of walk through how this worked with the textile industry. Okay, with textiles, coal and iron deposits could be used by clever engineers to build and power machines that could turn the plant materials into fabric much more quickly and also at a much greater scale than traditional home-based manufacturing could. Raw cotton could be brought in cheaply from the American South or from India especially after 1846 with new low tariffs and a free trade policy. Women and children could be employed at low wages to man the machines, meaning higher profits to the owners. And an ever-growing system of railways, canals, and turnpikes could move all of these raw materials and finished fabrics in between industrial centers, markets, and ports. And once Britain started on this road of industrial manufacture, it kind of becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop. It kind of grows and grows and grows over the 1800s. The material benefits of these early 19th century changes, they tended to accrue to the upper and middle classes. In the early 1800s, workers and the poor were very often actually worse off than their grandparents had been. As this first picture suggests, working conditions in factories were terrible. Workers were exposed to health hazards, dangers. They were made to work 10, 12, sometimes 14-hour days. Why did the workers just leave that terrible job? There's a few reasons for this, but one that I want to point out to you is that Britain had something called a poor law. And the poor law meant that if you could not support yourself or your family, you would be forcibly placed in something called a workhouse. So it's a little bit almost like a criminalization of poverty, where the poor have their freedom and their choices taken away, and they're moved to these workhouses instead. Here's a famous little Oliver Twist in the workhouse who has the audacity to ask for more gruel because he's hungry. As we see with Oliver Twist, the early 19th century was definitely a low point in the treatment of poor people in Britain. After about 1850, there begins a shift. For one thing, the government began to enact legislation to protect workers and to especially protect child workers. Okay? And there's also a shift in industrialization in general. From a global perspective, other countries begin to get in on the act. And this is called the Second Industrial Revolution from the late 1800s. The Second Industrial Revolution has two key characteristics that you want to remember. The first characteristic is that in the Second Industrial Revolution, it's highly competitive between states. Okay, back in the First Industrial Revolution, Britain was very far ahead of everyone else, and it took a long time for these other countries to start to industrialize. By 1870, however, France and the US, you can see in the chart, are accelerating to have a much bigger share, probably about as big as Britain's. Germany is threatening to outpace all of them, and even northern Italy, Russia, and Austria-Hungary are starting down this path of industrialization. So this is a very competitive climate between different countries. That's your first characteristic, competitive between countries. The second characteristic is that the types of things being produced started to change. Okay? In the First Industrial Revolution, that tends to be a story of mechanizing the production of goods that people were already using. For example, textiles, clothing. People had already been making that, and the Industrial Revolution changed how clothing was made, things people were already doing. That was the First Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution is characterized by increased production in new innovations. When you think Second Industrial Revolution, you want to think of heavy metal, iron and steel. And you want to think of brand new technologies like electricity, the telegraph, chemicals, petroleum. That's your Second Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century. The final trend that I want to examine with you today is Britain's expansion of democracy. So let me take it back to 1789 again. One of the reasons that the British responded so coldly to the ideals of the French Revolution was that they didn't face the same issues of autocracy that France did. Britain was in the middle of a long, gradual expansion of political rights and political participation. I'm not saying Britain was exactly a democracy in 1789, but it looked a lot more like one than France before the Revolution. Britain has a strong parliament in charge of taxation. They have a free press to voice their views. And they have a long tradition of petitioning for the redress of grievances. At the turn of the 19th century, members of parliament were elite aristocrats, but people often felt they could petition that member of parliament to still address issues or problems in that constituency. There are some setbacks. There's a terrible massacre in 1819 called the Peterloo Massacre when people were demonstrating. But I would say that's a little bit of an outlier for a general trend towards something that looks a little more like a pure democracy. Okay. One thing to mention is in 1832 Reform Bill. So in 1832, they expanded the suffrage to a larger portion of middle-class men. They made voting more uniform, and they created new seats for booming industrial areas like Manchester and Birmingham. These industrial areas had seemed to grow up almost overnight, and they had not had representation. So that was the 1832 Reform Bill. Going along with this democratic trend is you'll see the British monarch becomes increasingly sidelined and made into more of a figurehead and not a decision maker. This is a little bit different than what you may have seen in other European countries over the same time period. For example, remember that in France in 1830, Charles X had simply dissolved the Chamber of Deputies before they even met. And this was followed by the July Revolution. Okay, so compared to a situation like that, Britain looks pretty progressive. There will be agitation, there will sometimes be riots, but Britain does not experience a full-on revolution over the 19th century. And this whole time, it's really Parliament making the decisions, not Queen Victoria. Even people who could not vote found ways to participate politically. This is a cartoon from the 1840s showing a man signing a petition against the Corn Law. So he's able to participate that way, even if he might not be able to vote. The Corn Laws were a set of tariffs. I mentioned them before in connection with Ireland. These were tariffs that were intended to make domestic grain cheaper than imported grain. This was kind of favored by food producers and domestic farmers and some of the landlords. However, in a dramatic reversal of their sort of policies from the 1700s, the government repealed the Corn Laws in 1846. And the consumers liked this because it removed an artificial tax on imported corn. So corn from France might be the same price as corn from England. Next to the cartoon, we have a poster from 1839 announcing a meeting of a group called the Chartists. The Chartist movement attracted huge numbers of working people. They demanded and demonstrated that suffrage voting should be extended to all adult males, and they were also agitating to stamp out corruption. As you can see in the poster, they're very passionate. They've got that exclamation point there. They're excited about this, but they also want to emphasize they are not revolutionaries like those guys in France. Look at the bottom. They will get their way through peace, law, and order. So gradually you'll see groups like the Chartists becoming effective, right? We already saw a reform bill in 1832 that created new seats for places like Manchester and Birmingham. Okay, in 1867, a second Reform Act happens, and this act lowers the requirements to vote in such a way that actually the electorate doubles. A third Reform Act in 1884 extends the vote to almost all men, except for people in the armed forces or servants. Women were also attending demonstrations. They were involved with petitioning the government, and they were making some inroads into becoming full citizens. In the late 1800s, laws were passed allowing women to own their own property. The suffragettes grow and grow in numbers, and they agitate for the right of women to vote right through the early 1900s. So with all these examples, you can see maybe the greatest thing about Britain over the long 18th century was this gradual growth of democracy. They're able to keep things stable and not have a full revolution by gradually extending citizenship and extending rights to more and more people. I hope the examples I went over today show how militarism, imperialism, industrialization, and the expansion of democracy shaped life in Britain over the long 19th century. And here are some further resources if you want to learn more. Thanks so much for joining me today. So I have a little postscript for my friends in Utah, just to say, with a lecture of this type, I like to have my students apply these ideas to something. So, for example, if we had been meeting in person for 50 minutes, we would have stopped to actually discuss and break down that French Revolution cartoon for 5 to 10 minutes and really pinpoint exactly what's going on through discussion. Both not only to introduce the British point of view, but also as like a review of the French Revolution. And then at the end of class, more typically at the end of class, I'll have students dissect a primary source. But for this particular lecture, what I would have done is, as a class, we'll make just a big chart of bullet points of problem areas. So I was kind of keeping saying there were some like fissures or some weak points in the greatness, so we'd make a chart at the end of the class. And the idea behind that is that we're going to come back to that chart when we talk about decolonization in the 20th century. As my classes had moved to online, I would have students make that chart independently and send it to me as part of their weekly short quiz. So I just kind of wanted to put a little context of my spiel there for you. Thank you again for listening. I appreciate it, and have a great day.